I learned to read contracts before I learned to curtsy, and that single truth would one day save a duke from ruin and condemn me to love him. But I am getting ahead of myself, for every story must begin at its proper beginning, and mine began in silence, in service, in the shadows of a house that was never meant to know my name. My name is Clara Weston, and for 3 years I served as a chambermaid in Winterbourne Hall, the grand estate of the Fairfax family in the northern reaches of England. I was 22 years old when this story begins, though I felt much older, as those who have known loss often do. The weight of grief ages a person in ways that cannot be measured by calendars, and I had carried that weight since the age of 17, when everything I had known and loved was stripped away from me by fever and misfortune. My father had been a solicitor of some repute in our small village of Hartwell, a man who believed that knowledge was the only inheritance worth leaving a daughter. He was not wealthy, my father, but he was wise, and he understood that in a world that offered women so few opportunities, education was the only armor that could protect them. He taught me to read when I was 4, setting me upon his knee with a primer in hand, his patience infinite as I stumbled over letters and sounds. He taught me to write when I was 5, guiding my small hand across sheets of paper, showing me how words could be shaped into meaning. And before I had even learned to braid my own hair, he taught me to scrutinize legal documents with the precision of a hawk, to see the traps that lurked beneath beautiful language and honorable intentions. His study was my classroom, a cramped room at the back of our modest cottage, lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes. The smell of ink and old paper surrounded us like a familiar embrace whenever we entered. And to this day, that scent brings tears to my eyes with the force of its memory. He would sit me upon his knee before his cluttered desk, spreading contracts and agreements before us like maps to be studied, and he would point to clauses and sub-clauses, to the treacherous language that wealthy men use to trap the unwary. "Mind the fine print, Clara," he would say, his voice grave and tender all at once. "That is where the devil hides. The grand promises are written in bold letters for all to see, but the true intentions are whispered in the margins, in the footnotes, in the sub-clauses that most men never bother to read. A good solicitor must be a detective, searching for crimes that have not yet been committed. Do you understand?" I understood. Even then, young as I was, I understood that my father was giving me something precious, something that most daughters of his station would never receive. He was giving me the tools to protect myself in a world that would not protect me, weapons that could be wielded without ever raising a hand. My father died when I was 17, taken by a fever that swept through our village with merciless efficiency. It began as a cough, a minor irritation that he dismissed with his characteristic stubbornness. By the time he admitted that something was wrong, the illness had taken hold of his lungs with a grip that no physician could break. I sat beside his bed for 3 days and nights, holding his hand as his breath grew shallower, as the light in his eyes dimmed to embers and then to ash. In his final hours, when the fever had stolen his coherence, but not his love, he gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me. "You are stronger than you know, Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rattle in his chest. "Remember what I taught you. The world will try to make you small, but you must never let it succeed. You must never let them see that you are more than they expect you to be." I did not understand his words then. I was too consumed by grief, too shattered by the impending loss, to parse the meaning behind his final counsel. But in the years that followed, I would come to understand. He knew what awaited me. He knew the life that his death would condemn me to, and he was arming me for the battle that lay ahead. My mother had passed years before, a ghost I barely remembered, nothing more than the scent of lavender and the echo of a lullaby. She had died of childbirth fever when I was 3, taking with her an infant brother I had never had the chance to know. My father had raised me alone after that, pouring into me all the love that might have been divided among a larger family, all the hope and aspiration that the death of his wife had nearly extinguished. And so, when the fever claimed him at last, I found myself alone in the world, with nothing but my education and my grief. The cottage we had called home was rented, not owned, and the landlord wasted no time in reclaiming it. The debts my father had accumulated in his final years, desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of our former life, consumed everything we owned. The books were sold. The furniture was sold. Even the small pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, treasures I had kept hidden in a box beneath my bed, were taken to satisfy creditors whose patience had run out. I was left with nothing. No home, no family, no prospects, only the knowledge my father had given me, and even that I had to hide, for a young woman with too much education was viewed with suspicion by potential employers, seen as someone who might question orders or challenge authority. And so I sought employment in the only way a young woman of no means could. I became a servant. The agency in London was a grim place, a narrow building on a side street where desperate women came to offer themselves for domestic service. I sat on a hard wooden bench for hours, watching others file in and out, my bundle of possessions clutched on my lap like a talisman. When my turn finally came, I was interviewed by a stern woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through every pretense. "Can you read?" she asked. I hesitated only a moment before answering. "A little, madam." Simple words. The lie came easily, though it burned in my throat. My father's voice echoed in my mind. "They will try to make you small." Sometimes survival required becoming small, at least on the surface. I was placed at Winterbourne Hall 2 weeks later, one of 8 new servants hired to replace staff lost to age, marriage, or the endless churn of domestic service. Winterbourne Hall rose from the English countryside like a monument to generations of power and privilege, a castle of grey stone that had witnessed centuries of Fairfax glory and guarded their secrets with the silence of the grave. The estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of rolling hills and ancient forests, dotted with tenant farms and crossed by streams that sparkled like silver ribbons in the summer sun. The house itself was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, of grand rooms designed to impress and private spaces designed to conceal. Its walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch my every movement with silent disapproval, their painted eyes following me as I scrubbed and polished and made myself useful in 100 small ways. I arrived at Winterbourne Hall on a grey October morning, the kind of day when mist clung to the valleys and the sky seemed to press down upon the earth with the weight of coming winter. The head butler, Mr. Harrison, met the new servants at the tradesman's entrance, his face impassive as he catalogued us with a single sweep of his pale eyes. He was a tall man, thin as a reed, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a manner so formal that I sometimes wondered if he had been born speaking in the third person. "You will be assigned to the second floor," he told me, his voice clipped and precise. "Chambermaid duties. Mrs. Pemberton will explain your responsibilities. You are expected to be invisible, efficient, and silent. Any deviation from these expectations will result in immediate dismissal without reference. Is that clear?" It was clear. Everything about Winterbourne Hall was designed to remind servants of their place, to reinforce the invisible barriers that separated the aristocracy from those who served them. The servants' quarters were located in the attic and basement, as far from the family's living spaces as possible, connected by narrow staircases and service corridors that allowed us to move through the house without ever being seen by our betters, unless they wished it. I learned quickly. I learned to wake before dawn and retire after midnight, to subsist on cold meals eaten standing in the kitchen, to ignore the aches in my knees and the calluses on my hands. I cleaned their chambers, emptied their wash basins, and made their beds with corners so precise that even the exacting Mrs. Pemberton could find no fault. I learned to be invisible, to move through rooms as though I were made of shadow and silence, to never meet the eyes of my betters, to never speak unless spoken to. I buried Clara Weston, the solicitor's daughter, the girl who had dreamed of something more. And I became simply Clara, the chambermaid who knew her place. The current Duke of Winterbourne was Lord Adrian Fairfax, a man of 30 years who had inherited his title and his fortune upon his father's death 5 years prior. The late Duke had been a stern but fair master, respected by his tenants and feared by his servants, a man who had run the estate with the precision of a military campaign. His son, by all accounts, was cut from the same cloth, though perhaps harder, colder, more distant. Lord Adrian was tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who spent his days riding and hunting rather than languishing in drawing rooms. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, curling slightly at his temples in a way that softened the severe lines of his face, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, gray and turbulent, capable of warmth, but more often cold with aristocratic disdain. He moved through the world with the unconscious grace of a man who had never been denied anything, who had never had to question his place in the natural order. The servants whispered about him constantly, as servants do, weaving tales of his coldness, his pride, his refusal to marry, despite the endless parade of eligible young ladies who visited the estate with their ambitious mothers in tow. They called him the Ice Duke behind his back, a man whose heart had frozen over after some unnamed tragedy in his youth. Some said it was the death of his mother when he was a boy. Others whispered of a broken engagement, a love affair gone wrong, a betrayal that had taught him never to trust again. I paid little attention to these whispers. What did it matter to me if the Duke was cold or warm, cruel or kind? He was a figure as distant and untouchable as the moon, and I was merely one of the shadows that made his comfortable existence possible. "He barely knows we exist," one of the kitchen maids once said to me as we shared a rare moment of rest in the servants' hall. "I have been here 4 years, and he has never once looked at my face. We are furniture to him, Clara, nothing more." She was right. Lord Adrian moved through his ancestral home as though the servants were indeed furniture, obstacles to be navigated rather than people to be acknowledged. I had been in his direct presence perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, and he had never once looked at my face, never once registered my existence as anything more than a pair of hands performing a necessary function. I did not resent him for this. How could I, when I had been trained from my first day to seek invisibility, to regard any notice from the family as a failure of my duties? I understood the world in which we lived, the rigid hierarchies that separated the aristocracy from those who served them. I had no illusions about my station or my future. I would work until my body gave out, save what little I could, and hope for a quiet death in some charitable institution when I grew too old to be useful. This was the fate of women like me, and I had accepted it with the same stoic resignation with which I accepted the cold floors beneath my knees each morning as I scrubbed the marble. But fate, I would learn, had other plans. It was an October evening when everything changed, 3 years to the day since I had first passed through the gates of Winterbourne Hall, though I did not realize the significance of the date until much later. It was the kind of evening when the wind howled against the windows like a beast seeking entry, when the candles flickered in their sconces as though afraid of the darkness pressing in from outside. Rain lashed against the glass in sheets, and thunder rumbled in the distance, a portent of the storm that was about to break over all our lives. I was in the east corridor, replacing the candles in the wall sconces, a task I often performed in the late hours when the family had retired to the drawing room after dinner. The corridor was cold and drafty, the stone walls seeping the chill of centuries, and I worked quickly, eager to complete my rounds and seek the relative warmth of the servants' quarters. My fingers were numb as I fitted new tapers into their holders, and my thoughts were far away, wandering in the past, as they often did on lonely evenings. The corridor ran past the library, a magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes that I had never been permitted to touch. I had glimpsed it only through doorways, catching sight of its towering shelves and massive oak desk, the leather armchairs positioned before a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. It was the domain of the master of the house, a sanctuary where Lord Adrian conducted his business affairs and retreated from the demands of social obligation. As I worked, I heard voices from within. I should have moved on. A proper servant would have continued her work without a moment's pause, deaf to the conversations of her employers, blind to anything that did not concern her duties. But something in the tone of those voices made me hesitate, made me pause with a candle half raised, my ears straining despite my better judgment. There was Lord Adrian, his deep voice carrying a note of impatience I recognized from the few occasions I had heard him speak. He sounded weary, perhaps irritated, the voice of a man whose patience was being tested by an unwelcome visitor. And there was another voice, one I did not know, smooth and persuasive in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was the voice of a man selling something. I thought, the voice of a merchant or a confidence man, polished with practice and slick with false sincerity. "My lord, this is a remarkable opportunity," the stranger was saying. "Your father and I discussed this very partnership before his unfortunate passing. It was his dearest wish that our families be joined in this venture, that the Fairfax name be attached to an enterprise that will reshape the commercial landscape of this nation." Something about those words rang false to my ears, some discordance in the music of his rhetoric that my father had trained me to recognize. The invocation of the late Duke's wishes was too convenient, too perfectly calculated to appeal to Lord Adrian's sense of filial duty. And the extravagance of the promises, reshaping the commercial landscape, spoke of a man overselling his wares. I knew I should walk away. I knew the consequences of being caught eavesdropping, the dismissal without reference that would follow if anyone discovered me lingering outside the library door. But my father's training was too deeply ingrained, the instinct to investigate too powerful to ignore. I set down my basket of candles and moved closer to the library door, which stood slightly ajar, just enough to allow a sliver of light and sound to escape into the shadowed corridor. Through the gap, I could see Lord Adrian seated at his father's massive oak desk, a document spread before him like a map of contested territory. His dark brows were drawn together in concentration, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested discomfort, though whether with the document or the visitor I could not tell. His quill pen was poised in his hand, its tip hovering above the paper as though he were gathering the will to sign. Standing across from him was a man I did not recognize, perhaps 50 years of age, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a smile that did not reach his eyes. His features were handsome in a predatory way, the face of a man who had learned to use his appearance as a weapon, to disarm with charm what he could not take by force. He was dressed immaculately, his cravat tied with precision, his coat cut from expensive cloth. Everything about him calculated to convey respectability and wealth. Yet there was something in his manner that reminded me of a snake coiled in tall grass, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. "I have reviewed the terms," Lord Adrian said, his pen moving toward the document. "The partnership seems straightforward enough. A contribution of capital in exchange for a share of the profits from your shipping enterprise." "Indeed, my lord," the stranger replied. "A simple arrangement, mutually beneficial. Your capital, my expertise. The returns, as you can see, are projected to be substantial. Within 2 years, you will have doubled your investment, and the Fairfax name will be associated with one of the most profitable trading companies in the empire." 2 years, doubled investment. The words triggered something in my memory, a lesson from my father's study delivered on a winter afternoon when I was no more than 12. He had spread a contract before me, a document nearly identical in its promises to what this stranger was describing, and he had shown me the trap concealed within its language. "When someone promises you the moon and stars, Clara," he had said, "they are usually trying to steal the ground beneath your feet." My heart began to pound. I could not see the document from my position, but I could see Lord Adrian's hand moving toward the signature line, the pen descending like a guillotine blade. And every instinct my father had cultivated in me screamed that something was terribly wrong. The stranger's eagerness, the invocation of the late Duke's wishes, the pressure to sign on such a dark and isolated evening when no solicitor was present to review the terms. It was textbook manipulation, the very tactics my father had warned me about countless times. I did not think. I did not calculate the consequences. I simply acted. "Do not sign, my lord," I said, pushing open the library door and stepping into the light. Both men turned to stare at me. The moment stretched like taffy, time slowing to a crawl as the reality of what I had done crashed over me like a wave. I had burst into a private meeting between the Duke and his guest. I had spoken without being spoken to. I had presumed to advise my employer on matters that were none of my concern. Every rule I had learned in 3 years of service, every instinct of self-preservation, I had violated in a single, reckless instant. Lord Adrian's face registered shock first, his gray eyes widening as they took in my plain dress and white cap, the uniform of a servant who had no business interrupting a private meeting. Then came the outrage, a cold fury that settled over his features like frost spreading across a window pane. His jaw tightened, and I saw his hand clench around the pen he still held, his knuckles whitening with the force of his grip. The stranger's expression was more complex, a flash of something dark and dangerous passing across his features before being replaced by a look of bemused condescension. But I had seen that flash, that momentary glimpse behind the mask, and it confirmed everything I had suspected. This was a man with something to hide, a man whose smooth facade concealed depths of calculation and malice. "I beg your pardon," Lord Adrian said, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, the voice of a man who had never in his life been interrupted by a servant. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" I knew I should lower my eyes. I knew I should apologize and flee, to accept whatever punishment awaited me for such an unforgivable breach of propriety. My position was already lost. I was certain of that. No household would retain a chambermaid who had committed such an outrage. But the words would not stop coming, rising up from some deep well of conviction that overrode my terror. "The document, my lord," I said, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. "Please, look at the fine print, section 14, subsection 3. Lord Adrian's jaw tightened further. He looked from me to the stranger, then back to me, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. His pride demanded that he dismiss me immediately, that he punish this insolence with the full weight of his authority. But something in my face, something in the conviction with which I had spoken, must have given him pause. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, the novelty of a servant who dared to speak out of turn. Or perhaps it was something more, some instinct that whispered to him that this interruption was not the foolish impulse it appeared to be. He looked down at the document, his brow furrowing as he searched for the section I had named. His eyes moved across the dense text, the cramped handwriting, the labyrinthine clauses that lawyers used to conceal their true intentions. "This is absurd," the stranger said, and now I could hear the edge beneath his smooth tone, the crack in his carefully constructed facade. His voice had risen slightly, lost some of its cultured polish. "My lord, surely you are not going to take direction from a chambermaid? The girl is clearly deranged. Perhaps she has been sampling the cooking sherry. I must insist that you sign the document and have her removed immediately." But Lord Adrian was reading now, truly reading, his eyes moving rapidly across the page with an intensity that suggested he was seeing the document for the first time. And I watched as the color drained from his face, watched as comprehension dawned like a cold and terrible sunrise. His hand began to tremble slightly. "What is this?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying a threat that made the stranger take an involuntary step backward. The stranger, Thorne, dropped his mask of civility. The transformation was remarkable, a shedding of pretense that revealed the predator beneath the gentleman's clothing. His smile became something cold and cruel, his eyes hardening into chips of ice. He looked at me with undisguised hatred, the fury of a hunter whose prey had slipped the trap. "The language is merely standard legal protection," he said, but the smoothness had left his voice. "Standard provisions to protect my investment in case of unforeseen circumstances. Standard legal protection." Lord Adrian rose to his feet, and I saw for the first time the full force of his presence, the authority that generations of noble blood had bred into him. He towered over the desk, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the room, his gray eyes blazing with a fury that made even Thorn flinch. "This clause grants you controlling interest in my entire estate should the partnership fail to meet its projected returns within 2 years, returns that you have set at an impossible threshold, returns that no legitimate shipping venture could possibly achieve." He threw the document onto the desk, where it landed with a sound like a slap. "This is not a partnership, Thorn. This is theft. This is fraud. This is an attempt to steal everything my family has built over 10 generations. Thorn's veneer cracked further. I saw fear flicker in his eyes, quickly masked by defiance. "You cannot prove anything," he said. "It is merely a business disagreement, a misunderstanding of terms. Any court would side with me." "Any court?" Lord Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Any court would see you hanged for attempted fraud against a peer of the realm. You forget who you are dealing with, Thorn. I am not some country squire you can swindle with smooth words and false promises. I am the Duke of Winterbourne, and I will see you destroyed for this." Thorn's eyes darted to me, and I saw in them a hatred so pure and concentrated that it stole my breath. "It seems you have a spy in your household, my lord," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "How convenient for you. A chambermaid who happens to be versed in contract law. How very remarkable. But I wonder how the young lady knew to look for that particular clause. Unless, of course, she has seen similar documents before. Unless she is not quite the simple chambermaid she appears to be." My blood ran cold. I had been so focused on saving Lord Adrian from the trap that I had not considered what my intervention might reveal about my own past, about the education I had hidden so carefully for 3 years. Thorn was sharp, far sharper than I had given him credit for, and he had immediately recognized that my knowledge was not something a chambermaid should possess. Lord Adrian turned to look at me, really look at me, perhaps for the first time since I had entered his household. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made me want to shrink back into the shadows where I belonged. I felt exposed, stripped of the careful anonymity I had cultivated, laid bare before his scrutiny. "Who are you?" he asked. Before I could answer, he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man whose pride had been wounded, who found himself indebted to someone so far beneath his station that the very idea was absurd. It was the laugh of a man who did not know whether to be grateful or humiliated, and had chosen humiliation as the easier path. "A chambermaid," he said, shaking his head with bitter amusement. "I was nearly destroyed, and I was saved by a chambermaid's intervention. How perfectly humiliating. The great Duke of Winterbourne, rescued from his own foolishness by a girl who scrubs floors." The words cut deeper than I expected. I had saved him from ruin, from the loss of everything his family had built, and his response was to mock me. But I kept my face still, my emotions buried beneath the mask of servitude I had worn for so long. I had been trained too well to show pain, too thoroughly conditioned to accept my place. "I apologize for the intrusion, my lord," I said, dropping my gaze to the floor. "I will accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. Get out," he said, "both of you. Now." Edmund Thorne gathered his document with shaking hands, his face mottled with rage. "This is not over, Fairfax," he hissed. "You will regret this insult." He swept past me without a glance, and I heard his footsteps echoing down the corridor, followed by the distant slam of the front door. I remained where I was, waiting for Lord Adrian to pronounce my fate. Dismissal without reference, most likely. Perhaps worse. I had overstepped so grievously that no punishment would seem too severe. But when I finally dared to raise my eyes, I found him staring at me with an expression I could not read. The anger was still there, but beneath it was something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. "Your name," he said. "Clara, my lord. Clara Weston. How did you know to look for that clause, Miss Weston?" His voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by a wary interest that made me deeply uneasy. I hesitated. The truth was dangerous, a weapon that could be used against me if it fell into the wrong hands. But I had already revealed too much, and lies would only make things worse. "My father was a solicitor, my lord," I said quietly. "Before he died, he taught me to read contracts, to find the traps hidden in the language." Lord Adrian absorbed this information in silence. He looked at the document on his desk, then at me, then at the document again. "You may go," he said finally. "Report to Mrs. Pemberton in the morning. I will decide what is to be done with you." I curtsied and fled, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As I hurried through the dark corridors to the servants' quarters, I told myself that it did not matter. I had done what was right. Whatever consequences followed, I could face them with my conscience clear. But I could not shake the memory of his eyes, the way they had held mine in that moment of recognition. He had seen me, truly seen me, and something in that gaze had stirred feelings I had thought long dead. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed in the room I shared with 2 other maids, staring at the ceiling and waiting for dawn to bring my judgment. I had been a fool to intervene, a fool to reveal my education, a fool to believe that my father's lessons could be of any use in a world where women like me were meant to be silent and invisible. By morning, I would likely be on the road, my meager possessions in a bundle on my back, my reputation in tatters. But morning brought something unexpected. When I reported to Mrs. Pemberton as instructed, I found her waiting with an expression of barely concealed shock. "The Duke wishes to see you in the library," she said, her tone suggesting that I had somehow committed an offense against nature itself. "Whatever you have done, girl, I pray it is not as serious as it appears." I followed her through the house in silence, my stomach churning with dread. The library, in the pale light of morning, looked different than it had the night before. Less threatening, perhaps, but no less imposing. Lord Adrian stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the misty grounds. "Leave us," he said without turning around. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, clearly scandalized by the idea of leaving a maid alone with the master of the house, but she was too well trained to argue. She curtsied and withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood in the center of the room, my eyes fixed on the carpet, waiting. "I have spent the night reviewing my affairs," Lord Adrian said at last. "It seems that Mr. Edmund Thorne has been circling my family for years, waiting for an opportunity to strike. My father suspected him of impropriety, but could never prove it. Had I signed that document last night, I would have lost everything within 2 years. My estate, my fortune, my family's legacy for 10 generations. All of it, gone." He turned to face me, and I forced myself to meet his eyes. "You saved me from utter destruction, Miss Weston," he continued. "A chambermaid. A servant I had never deigned to notice. Do you have any idea how that feels?" "I imagine it is uncomfortable, my lord," I said carefully. He laughed again, but this time there was genuine humor in it, though tinged with bitterness. "Uncomfortable. Yes, I suppose that is one word for it." He moved closer, and I had to fight the urge to step back. "You were clever to hide your education. The other servants would not have accepted you if they knew. The aristocracy certainly would not." I said nothing. He was right, and we both knew it. "I find myself in an impossible position," he said. "I owe you a debt that I can never repay, yet you are a chambermaid, Any recognition I give you will raise questions. Any reward will cause scandal." He paused, studying my face with that unsettling intensity. "What do you want, Miss Weston? Name your price." I thought of my father, of the lessons he had taught me, of the life I had lost. I thought of the cold mornings and the aching knees, the endless labor that left me too exhausted to dream. I could ask for money, I could ask for a reference, for help finding a better position in another house. I could ask for 100 things that might improve my circumstances without causing scandal for either of us. Instead, I said something that surprised us both. "I want nothing, my lord." I did not act for reward. I acted because it was right. Lord Adrian's expression shifted, something flickering in his gray eyes that I could not name. "You are either a saint or a fool, Miss Weston," he said softly. "Perhaps both, my lord." He was silent for a moment, and I wondered if I had offended him. But then he nodded, as if I had passed some test he had not revealed. "You will continue in your position," he said. "For now. But I am not finished with you, Miss Weston. There is more to you than meets the eye, and I intend to discover what it is." With that dismissal, I curtsied and left the library, my mind spinning with questions that had no answers. I had expected punishment, perhaps dismissal, perhaps worse. Instead, I had been given a reprieve and a warning. The Duke of Winterbourne was watching me now, and I did not know whether to be relieved or afraid. The days that followed were strange and unsettling. On the surface, nothing had changed. I continued my duties as before, scrubbing floors and changing linens and emptying chamber pots, the invisible machinery that kept the great house running. But I was aware, always aware, of Lord Adrian's presence in a way I had never been before. When he passed me in the corridor, his eyes would find mine for the briefest moment. When I entered a room he occupied, I could feel his gaze following my movements, studying me as though I were a puzzle he was determined to solve. The other servants noticed, of course. They always did. Whispers followed me through the halls, speculation about what had transpired in the library that night, about why the Duke had taken such sudden interest in a common chambermaid. Mrs. Pemberton watched me with suspicion, clearly convinced that I had done something improper to capture the master's attention. I ignored them all as best I could, focusing on my work, counting the days until Lord Adrian's curiosity would fade and I could return to my comfortable anonymity. But his curiosity did not fade. If anything, it grew. 2 weeks after the incident with Mr. Thorne, I was summoned to the library again. This time, Lord Adrian did not pretend to be looking out the window. He was seated at his desk, a stack of documents before him, and he gestured for me to approach. "I require your assistance, Miss Weston," he said without preamble. "These documents were prepared by my previous solicitor, who has recently retired. I have engaged a new man, but he cannot arrive for several weeks. In the meantime, I have business that cannot wait." He pushed the stack toward me. "Review these. Tell me if you find anything of concern." I stared at the documents, then at him. "My lord," I said slowly, "surely you cannot mean for me to do this. I am a chambermaid. You are a chambermaid who reads contracts better than any solicitor I have ever employed," he replied. "The circumstances are unusual, I grant you. But I find that I trust your judgment more than that of any man currently in my service." He paused, and something like a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Consider it a temporary promotion." I should have refused. I should have reminded him of the impropriety, of the scandal that could result if it became known that the Duke of Winterbourne was consulting a servant girl on matters of business. But the documents called to me, awakening something that had lain dormant for years. My father's voice echoed in my memory, and I thought of all the knowledge he had given me, wasted on scrubbing floors and emptying wash basins. I picked up the first document and began to read. The hours that followed were the happiest I had experienced since my father's death. Lord Adrian watched in silence as I worked, making notes in the margin, flagging clauses that seemed unclear or potentially dangerous. The documents were mostly routine, leases and contracts, and correspondence with various business associates, but I found several instances of language that could have been exploited by an unscrupulous party. When I had finished, I presented my findings with the detachment of a professional, careful not to let my emotions show. Lord Adrian reviewed my notes, his expression thoughtful. "You have a gift, Miss Weston," he said at last. "It is a crime that you are wasting it in service." "I have no choice in the matter, my lord. The world is not kind to women of my station." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He set down the documents and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. But perhaps it should be. I did not know what to say to that. The silence stretched between us, heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous. "You may go," he said finally. "But return tomorrow at the same time. I have more documents that require your attention." And so it began. What started as a single consultation became a daily appointment, a ritual that both of us came to depend upon in ways we did not yet understand. Every afternoon, when the household was quiet and the other servants were occupied with their duties, when the great house seemed to hold its breath in the languor of midday, I would slip into the library and spend 2 hours reviewing Lord Adrian's papers. I entered through the servants' door, a narrow passage hidden behind a bookcase that allowed me to come and go without attracting notice. It was a necessary precaution, one that Adrian himself had suggested, for the appearance of a chambermaid meeting privately with the Duke would have set tongues wagging throughout the county. He was always there, sometimes working on his own correspondence at the great oak desk, sometimes simply sitting in one of the leather armchairs by the fire, watching me with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. The first few weeks were awkward, constrained by the vast gulf that separated our stations, by the uncertainty of this strange new arrangement that defied every convention of the society in which we lived. I kept my eyes fixed on the documents before me, speaking only when I had a question about some clause or provision, maintaining the formal distance that propriety demanded. But slowly, as the days lengthened and the winter darkness pressed against the library windows, the silences began to fill with words. He asked about my father first, tentative questions about the man who had given me such an unusual education. I found myself telling him things I had not spoken of in years, memories that had lain dormant in the depths of my heart, waiting for someone who might understand. I told him of the small study filled with books, the way dust motes danced in the afternoon light that streamed through the single window. I told him of the lessons that had shaped my mind, the hours spent parsing legal language until I could read a contract the way a musician reads a score, hearing the harmonies and discords that lay beneath the surface. I told him of the fever that had taken my father from me, the way his hand had grown cold in mine as dawn broke on his final day, the silence that had swallowed my world when he drew his last breath. Adrian listened with an attention that surprised me. He did not interrupt, did not dismiss my grief as the sentimental weakness of a woman. He simply listened, his eyes never leaving my face, and when I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "He sounds like a remarkable man," he said at last. "You were fortunate to have had him, even for such a short time." I agreed, and I was surprised to find that the words did not hurt as much as they once had. Perhaps it was the act of speaking them aloud, of sharing my memories with another person for the first time since my father's death. Perhaps it was simply Adrian's presence, the steady regard of those gray eyes that seemed to understand without needing explanation. After that, the barriers between us began to crumble. He asked about my life in service, and I described the cold mornings and the aching muscles, the calluses on my hands and the perpetual chill in my bones. I told him of the small indignities that accumulated into a weight I carried always, the way the other servants had shunned me at first because I was too quiet, too strange, too different from what a chambermaid should be. I told him of Mrs. Pemberton's exacting standards, of the endless labor that left me too exhausted to dream, of the loneliness of being invisible in a world that did not see me as human. He listened to all of it, and I saw something change in his eyes as I spoke. The aristocratic disdain that had been his shield for so long began to crack, and beneath it I glimpsed something that looked almost like shame. "I never thought about it," he said one afternoon, as we sat together by the fire while rain streaked the library windows. "The people who make my life comfortable, the hands that prepare my food, clean my chambers, light the fires that warm me. I saw them as part of the machinery of the house, as interchangeable as the gears of a clock. I never thought of them as people with their own lives, their own dreams, their own sorrows." He turned to look at me, and there was something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "I am ashamed of that now," he said quietly. "You have opened my eyes to my own blindness, Clara. I do not know whether to thank you or resent you for it." I did not know what to say. The admission was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I had come to expect from a man of his station, that I found myself momentarily speechless. In my experience, the aristocracy did not question the natural order of things. They accepted their privilege as their birthright and spent little time contemplating the lives of those who served them. But Adrian was different. I was beginning to understand that now. Beneath the cold exterior, beneath the mask of ducal authority, there was a man who thought deeply about the world around him, who questioned assumptions that others took for granted. The Ice Duke, the servants called him, but I was coming to see that the ice was not his nature. It was his armor, a defense he had constructed against a world that had wounded him in ways I did not yet understand. In return for my confidences, he told me of his own burdens. The pressure to marry and produce an heir, the constant parade of eligible young ladies who arrived at Winterbourne Hall with their ambitious mothers, each one more determined than the last to secure the Duke as a prize. He described the tedium of their conversations, the shallow flattery, the way they looked at him and saw only his title and his fortune, never the man beneath. "They do not see me," he said, echoing my own words from an earlier conversation. "They see the Duke of Winterbourne, a name on a marriage contract, a means to secure their family's social standing. They do not care who I am, or what I think, or what I feel. I am nothing to them but a title." I thought of the endless stream of beautiful, accomplished young ladies who had passed through the halls of Winterbourne Hall during my years of service. I had glimpsed them in their fine gowns and glittering jewels, had overheard their tinkling laughter and practiced smiles. I had envied them in a distant, abstract way for the ease of their lives, for the opportunities that would never be open to someone like me. But I had never considered that they might be as trapped by their circumstances as I was by mine. He told me of his mother, who had died when he was young, leaving behind only a portrait in the gallery and a void that had never been filled. He spoke of her rarely, and only with great difficulty, but I came to understand that her loss had shaped him more profoundly than anything else in his life. She had been the warmth in his childhood, the counterbalance to his father's stern expectations, and when she was gone, the house had grown cold in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. He told me of his father, the late Duke, a man who had loved him but had never learned to show it. "Duty was his religion," Adrian said one evening, staring into the fire with an expression of old grief. "He believed that sentiment was a weakness, that emotions were to be mastered and suppressed, that a man's worth was measured by his ability to fulfill his obligations without complaint. He meant well, I suppose. He was preparing me for the burdens I would inherit. But there were times when I wished he could have simply told me he was proud of me, that he loved me, that I was more to him than an heir." I reached out and took his hand without thinking, a gesture so natural and yet so profoundly improper that I felt the shock of it travel through us both. For a moment, neither of us moved. His hand was warm in mine, larger than I had expected, the palm calloused from years of riding. Then he turned to look at me, And I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own confusion, my own longing, my own terror at the impossible thing that was growing between us. We did not speak of it. We did not name what was happening, as though the naming of it might make it real and force us to confront its impossibility. But from that moment on, something had shifted between us. The distance that propriety demanded had collapsed, and in its place was something far more dangerous. We were both, I realized, survivors. We had both been shaped by loss and hardship, had both learned to build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from further pain. And now, together, we were slowly learning to take those walls down. I knew it was madness. I knew that nothing could come of this connection, that the gulf between a duke and a chambermaid was unbridgeable no matter how many walls we dismantled. But knowledge and feeling are two very different things, and my heart had stopped listening to the dictates of reason. I was falling in love with him. It crept up on me slowly, this feeling, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. I noticed things I should not have noticed. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he was deep in thought. The rare smile that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. The sound of his voice, low and rich, speaking my name. Miss Weston. It should have been cold and formal, but somehow, on his lips, it sounded like music. I tried to stop it. I reminded myself constantly of the impossibility of my feelings. He was a duke, and I was a servant. The distance between us was unbridgeable, carved by centuries of tradition and reinforced by every structure of our society. Even if he felt something for me, which was absurd to imagine, nothing could come of it. I would be ruined, dismissed without reference, cast out into a world that had no place for fallen women, and he would be scandalized. His reputation tarnished by association with a chambermaid who had dared to rise above her station. But knowing something is impossible does not make the heart stop wanting. It was a November evening, the first snow of the season falling softly outside the library windows when everything changed again. I was reviewing a property lease, marking a questionable clause in the margins, when I felt Lord Adrian's presence beside me. He had risen from his desk without my noticing, and now he stood so close that I could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Clara," he said, and the use of my Christian name sent a shock through me. I looked up and found his face inches from mine, his eyes dark with an emotion I was afraid to name. "My lord," I whispered, but he shook his head. "Adrian," he said, "when we are alone, I want you to call me Adrian." "I cannot." "Why not?" "Because it would be improper, because it would be dangerous, because I am a servant, and you are a duke, and there are rules that govern these things, rules that exist for good reason." He was so close now that I could see the individual flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could count the dark lashes that framed them. "I have spent my entire life following rules," he said softly. "Rules that tell me whom I may speak to, whom I may associate with, whom I may love. I have played the role that was assigned to me since birth, and I have never questioned it. Until now. Until you." He raised his hand, and I felt his fingers brush my cheek, featherlight, barely there. "You have ruined me, Clara Weston. You have shown me that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong, and I do not know whether to thank you or curse you for it." My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain he could hear it. Every instinct screamed at me to pull away, to remind him of the impossibility of what he was suggesting, to save us both from the destruction that would surely follow. But I could not move. "This cannot happen," I said, and my voice was barely a whisper. "I know. We would both be ruined. I know." "Then why?" He leaned closer, and I felt his breath warm against my lips. "Because some things are worth the ruin," he said. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But when I did not pull away, when my hands rose of their own accord to clutch the fabric of his coat, something broke open between us. The kiss deepened, became something urgent and desperate, the release of weeks of unspoken longing that neither of us had dared to acknowledge. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own terror and wonder. "Adrian," I whispered, testing the name on my tongue, and he smiled, a real smile, the first I had ever seen from him. "Say it again. Adrian." He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me, and I let myself be held. For one perfect moment, there were no dukes and no servants, no rules and no consequences. There was only this, only us, two people who had found each other against all odds. But perfect moments, I would learn, never last. The weeks that followed were a dream from which I did not want to wake. Our meetings in the library continued, but now they were charged with a new electricity, a current of unspoken promises that ran beneath every conversation. We could not be open about our feelings, could not acknowledge them even to each other except in stolen glances and brief touches when we were certain we were alone. The risk was too great, the consequences too dire. But love, I discovered, is not easily contained. It spills over, finds cracks in even the most carefully constructed facades. And there were eyes watching that neither of us had noticed. It was December when the letter arrived. I found it on my pillow one evening after returning from my duties, a folded sheet of paper sealed with unmarked wax. My name was written on the front in an elegant hand that I did not recognize. I broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the words that would shatter my fragile happiness. "Miss Weston," it began, "I trust this letter finds you well. I write to inform you that your secret has been discovered. I know what transpires between you and the Duke, and I know the truth of your past, truths that you have hidden even from him. Your father was not merely a solicitor who fell on hard times. He was a thief who embezzled from his clients and died in disgrace, leaving debts that should have seen you in prison alongside him. Only the kindness of those he wronged spared you that fate, and only your silence has kept that shame hidden all these years. I offer you a choice. You will leave Winterbourne Hall within the fortnight and never return. You will sever all contact with Lord Adrian Fairfax, offering no explanation for your departure. In exchange, your secret will remain safe, and the Duke will be spared the embarrassment of learning that he has given his heart to the daughter of a common criminal. If you refuse, I will ensure that every drawing room in England knows the truth about Clara Weston. Your reputation will be destroyed, and the Duke will be humiliated by association. The choice is yours." The letter was unsigned, but I did not need a signature to know who had sent it. Edmund Thorne. The man whose scheme I had thwarted that October night. He had promised revenge, and now he was delivering it. I read the letter 3 times, each time hoping that the words would change, that I had somehow misunderstood. But the meaning was clear. He knew about my father. He knew the truth that I had buried so deep that I had almost convinced myself it did not exist. My father had been a good man. I believed that still. But he had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, born of desperation and a desire to provide for me after my mother's death. He had borrowed money from client accounts, intending to repay it, but the debts had mounted faster than he could manage. By the time the fever took him, he was ruined, and only the reluctance of his former clients to speak ill of the dead had kept the scandal from becoming public. I had spent 5 years running from that truth. I had buried Clara Weston, the solicitor's daughter, and become Clara, the chambermaid who knew her place. I had thought I was safe. I had been wrong. The days that followed were the worst of my life. I went through the motions of my duties, scrubbing and cleaning and serving, but my mind was elsewhere, trapped in an endless spiral of fear and despair. I avoided the library, making excuses when summoned, unable to face Adrian with the weight of this secret pressing down on me. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Clara," he said, catching my arm as I tried to slip past him in the corridor one evening. "What is wrong? You have been avoiding me for days." I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. "Nothing is wrong, my lord. I have been unwell." "You are lying." His voice was gentle, but I could hear the hurt beneath it. "Have I done something to offend you? If I have been too forward, if I have made you uncomfortable, you must tell me." The concern in his voice broke something inside me. I looked up, and I saw in his face the same fear that haunted my own heart, the fear of losing something precious before it had even truly been found. "It is not you," I whispered. "It is me. There are things about me that you do not know, things that would change how you see me." "Then tell me." "I cannot." He took both of my hands in his grip warm and steady. "Clara," he said, "I do not care about your past. I care about who you are now, the woman who saved me from ruin, the woman who has shown me that there is more to life than duty and obligation. Whatever secrets you carry, they cannot change what I feel for you." The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, running down my cheeks in hot, shameful rivers. "You do not know what you are saying. Then help me understand. Trust me, please." I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But Thorne's letter burned in my pocket, a reminder of everything I stood to lose. If I told Adrian the truth, he might forgive me. Or he might see me as I saw myself in my darkest moments, as the daughter of a criminal, unworthy of his love. I could not bear to see that look in his eyes. I pulled my hands from his and stepped back. "I cannot," I said again. "Please, just let me go." I turned and fled before he could stop me, my heart shattering with every step. That night, I made my decision. I would do as Thorne demanded. I would leave Winterbourne Hall, leave Adrian, leave everything I had come to love. It was the only way to protect him, to spare him the scandal that would follow if my past was revealed. Better a clean break than a lingering wound that would never heal. I began to pack my meager belongings, folding my spare dress and my father's last letter into the small bundle that represented everything I owned. I had almost finished when a knock came at my door. It was late, far too late for any of the other servants to be awake. I opened the door cautiously, expecting perhaps Mrs. Pemberton with some urgent task that could not wait. Instead, I found Adrian. He stood in the narrow corridor of the servants' quarters, his coat thrown hastily over his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it. Behind him, I could see the flickering light of a single candle, casting long shadows on the walls. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, pulling him inside before anyone could see. "If you are discovered in the servants' quarters, there will be talk. I do not care about talk." He looked around my tiny room, taking in the narrow bed, the cracked wash basin, the bundle of belongings on the floor. His face darkened. "You are leaving." It was not a question. I must. "Why?" I could not answer. The words stuck in my throat, choking me. "Clara." He took my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. I have spent the last 3 hours searching for answers. I went through my father's papers, his correspondence, everything I could find. I know about Edmund Thorne. I know that he and my father had a falling out years ago over a business dispute, and I know that Thorne has been seeking revenge on the Fairfax family ever since. He paused, his gray eyes searching mine. "I also know that Thorne's solicitor was a man named Robert Weston," he said quietly. "A man who died 5 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained." The room seemed to tilt around me. I reached out blindly and Adrian caught me, steadying me against his chest. "I found the letters," he continued, "the accusations, the debts. I know what your father did, Clara. I know everything." I closed my eyes, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. "Then you know why I must leave. I am not who you thought I was. I am the daughter of a thief, a criminal. If people discover the truth, your reputation will be destroyed. I cannot do that to you." His arms tightened around me. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," he said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "Do you truly believe that I care about my reputation? That I would let you sacrifice yourself to protect me from scandal?" I opened my eyes and found him smiling, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his face. "Your father made mistakes," he said. "But he was also the man who taught you to read contracts, who gave you the education that saved me from ruin. Whatever his sins, he loved you. That is evident in everything you are." He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch infinitely gentle. "I will not let you be punished for his choices. And I will not let Edmund Thorne take you from me." "But the letter," I whispered. "He said he would tell everyone. Let him." Adrian's voice hardened with determination. "Let him try. I am the Duke of Winterbourne. My family has survived scandal before, and we will survive it again. What matters is not what society thinks of us. What matters is what we think of ourselves." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall again. "I love you, Clara Weston," he said. "I love you for your courage and your intelligence, and your stubborn refusal to know your place. I love you for saving me when I did not deserve to be saved, and for showing me that there is more to life than duty and expectation. And I will not let anyone, not Thorne, not society, not even you, take that away from me." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. In all my calculations, in all my careful planning, I had never accounted for this, for a man who would choose love over reputation, who would defy the rigid hierarchies of our world for the sake of a chambermaid. "You would ruin yourself for me," I said. "No." He smiled again, and this time there was something fierce in it. "I would rebuild myself with you, starting now." And then he kissed me, there in my tiny room in the servants' quarters, with my meager belongings packed on the floor and the future stretching before us like an unwritten page. When we finally broke apart, my head spinning with the impossibility of it all, he took my hand and led me out into the corridor. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To find Edmund Thorne," he said grimly, "and to end this once and for all." The confrontation with Thorne took place the following morning, in the very library where our story had begun. Adrian had sent a message at dawn, summoning Thorne to Winterbourne Hall under the pretense of wishing to discuss a new business arrangement. Thorne, believing that his threats had succeeded, arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, his silver hair immaculately arranged and his smile as cold and predatory as ever. I was there when he entered, standing beside Adrian at the great oak desk. I saw the flash of surprise in Thorne's eyes, quickly masked by contempt. "I see you have brought your pet," he said, his lip curling. "How touching. But I had thought Miss Weston would have departed by now." Our little agreement was quite clear. Adrian's expression did not change, but I felt his hand tighten on mine, hidden behind the desk where Thorne could not see. "There is no agreement," Lord Adrian said calmly, "and there never will be. I know what you have done, Thorne, the forged documents, the attempts to defraud my family, the threats against Miss Weston and her family's reputation." Thorne's smile wavered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Threats? I have made no threats. I merely offered Miss Weston some friendly advice. A woman of her background should be careful about reaching above her station. Such ambition rarely ends well." Adrian released my hand and stepped forward, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into something almost frightening. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not speak to Miss Weston again. You will not write to her. You will not approach her. You will not so much as breathe in her direction. If I discover that you have made any attempt to harm her reputation or her person, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. Do you understand? Thorne's composure finally cracked. His face reddened, and he took a step toward Adrian, his hands clenching into fists. You dare to threaten me? Over a servant girl? You are a fool, Fairfax. Your father would be ashamed. My father, Adrian said, was a man who recognized your true nature years ago and cut all ties with you. I only wish I had listened to his warnings sooner. He reached into the desk drawer and withdrew a sheaf of papers. These are the records of your business dealings for the past 10 years. My new solicitor has been quite thorough. Tax fraud, embezzlement, bribery of government officials. I have enough evidence here to see you imprisoned for the rest of your natural life. Thorne's face went pale. Where did you get those? That is not your concern. What should concern you is what I intend to do with them. Adrian set the papers on the desk, his expression implacable. You have two choices. You can leave England tonight, never to return, and I will ensure that these documents never see the light of day. Or you can stay and face the consequences of your actions. The choice is yours. For a long moment, Thorne stood frozen, his eyes darting from Adrian to me, to the damning papers on the desk. I could see the calculations running through his mind, the weighing of risks and rewards that I had learned to recognize from my father's teachings. Finally, he straightened his coat and lifted his chin, attempting to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his schemes. This is not over, he said. Yes, Adrian replied. It is. Thorne turned and walked out of the library without another word. I watched him go, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Is it truly finished? I asked, not quite able to believe it. Adrian turned to me, and the cold fury had faded from his face, replaced by something warm and tender. It is finished, he said. He drew me into his arms, holding me close. You are safe, Clara. I promise you. He will never hurt you again. I buried my face in his chest, letting the tears fall freely now, tears of relief and gratitude, and a joy so overwhelming that it felt like pain. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, while the winter sunlight streamed through the library windows, and the world outside continued on, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded within these walls. But our story was not yet complete. The weeks that followed were a time of transition, of careful negotiation between the world as it was and the world as we wished it to be. Adrian announced to the household that I was no longer a servant but a guest, a distant cousin of some sort who had fallen on hard times and whom he had charitably taken in. The fiction was transparent to anyone who cared to look closely, but it provided a veneer of respectability that allowed us to be seen together without causing immediate scandal. Mrs. Pemberton was horrified, of course. The other servants whispered and speculated. But Adrian's authority was absolute within the walls of Winterbourne Hall, and no one dared to challenge him openly. In those quiet weeks, I discovered a side of Adrian that I had only glimpsed before. Without the pressure of our forbidden circumstances, he revealed himself to be kind and thoughtful, a man who listened when I spoke and valued my opinions on matters great and small. We spent hours in the library, not reviewing documents now, but simply talking, sharing the stories of our lives, weaving together the threads that would bind us. I told him about my mother, the gentle woman whose face I could barely remember. I told him about my father's study, the smell of ink and old paper, the lessons that had shaped my mind. I told him about the years of service, the cold mornings and the aching knees, the loneliness of being invisible in a world that did not see me as human. In return, he told me of his childhood, the rigid expectations of a ducal heir, the father who had loved him but never learned to show it. He told me of his mother, who had died when he was young, leaving behind only a portrait in the gallery and a void that had never been filled. He told me of the endless pressure to marry, to produce an heir, to perpetuate a legacy that sometimes felt more like a prison than an inheritance. We were both, I realized, survivors. We had both been shaped by loss and hardship, had both learned to build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from further pain. And now together, we were slowly learning to take those walls down. It was on a February evening, with the snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in the library hearth, that Adrian finally spoke the words I had been both dreading and longing to hear. "Clara," he said, taking my hands in his, "I want you to be my wife." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Adrian," I said carefully, "you know that is impossible. I am a servant, a chambermaid, the daughter of a disgraced solicitor. If you marry me, society will never accept you again. I do not care about society, you say that now, but you are a duke. You have responsibilities, obligations. You cannot simply abandon them for the sake of love." He smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that still had the power to make my breath catch. "I have spent my entire life fulfilling obligations," he said. "I have done everything that was expected of me, everything that duty required. And what has it brought me? Loneliness, isolation, the constant companionship of people who see only my title and my fortune, never the man beneath." He raised my hands to his lips and kissed them, a gesture so tender that tears sprang to my eyes. "You see me, Clara. You see the man I truly am, beneath the mask I have worn for so long. You challenge me, you inspire me, you make me want to be better than I am. I do not want to spend the rest of my life without you. I cannot." "But the scandal," I whispered. "Your family name. My family name means nothing if I am miserable, and I would rather face 1,000 scandals with you by my side than spend one more day alone in this empty house." He cupped my face in his hands, his gray eyes shining with an emotion that matched my own. "Please, Clara, say yes. Let me spend the rest of my life loving you." I thought of everything I had learned in my years of service, all the rules and hierarchies that govern the world of the aristocracy. I thought of the whispers that would follow us, the doors that would close, the judgment of a society that did not forgive transgressions against its rigid order. And then I thought of Adrian, of the man who had looked beyond my station to see the woman beneath, who had fought for me when no one else would, who had offered me his heart with no expectation of return. The choice in the end was not difficult at all. "Yes," I said. Adrian's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it transformed him entirely. He pulled me into his arms and kissed me, there in the library where our story had begun, and I felt, for the first time in my life, that I had truly come home. We were married in the spring, in the small chapel on the grounds of Winterbourne Hall. It was not the grand society wedding that a duke would normally command. There were no hundreds of guests, no elaborate ceremony, no newspaper announcements heralding the union. Instead, there were only a handful of witnesses, the local vicar, Mrs. Pemberton, and a few of the servants who had come to know and respect me during my time in their ranks. I wore a simple gown of white muslin, nothing like the elaborate confections that adorned the society brides in their portraits. My hair was dressed with wildflowers from the garden, and I carried a bouquet of roses that Adrian had cut himself that morning. He stood at the altar in his finest coat, his dark hair neatly combed, his gray eyes shining with an emotion that made my heart ache with its intensity. When I took his hand and spoke my vows, I saw tears glistening in those eyes, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The scandal came, of course. It was inevitable. Word spread through the ton like wildfire. The Duke of Winterbourne had married his chambermaid. The gossip was vicious and unrelenting. Drawing rooms buzzed with speculation about what dark arts I must have employed to ensnare such a prize. Former friends turned their backs on Adrian. Invitations that had once filled his correspondence now dwindled to nothing. But we had expected this. We had prepared for it. Adrian devoted himself to managing his estates, to improving the lives of his tenants, to being the kind of landlord and master that his father had been before him. He did not need society's approval to fulfill his duties, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not miss the endless round of balls and parties and empty conversations that had once filled his days. As for me, I discovered that there was more to being a duchess than wearing fine gowns and attending social functions. I became Adrian's partner in all things, reviewing documents and contracts as I had in those early days, managing the household with the efficiency I had learned as a servant, advocating for the welfare of the workers on our estates. The people who depended on Winterbourne Hall did not care about the scandal that had accompanied my elevation. They saw only that the new duchess worked tirelessly on their behalf, that she remembered their names and their children's names, that she treated them with the dignity and respect that she herself had been denied for so many years. I earned their loyalty not through my title, but through my actions, and that loyalty was worth more to me than any acceptance from the ton. There were hard times. Of course, there always are. The first year of our marriage was marred by a series of setbacks that would have broken a lesser union. A fire in one of the tenant cottages, a poor harvest that strained our resources. The death of Mrs. Pemberton, who had never quite forgiven me for my ascension, but who had become, in her own gruff way, something like a friend. And there was the matter of Edmund Thorne. True to his word, he had left England after our confrontation. But he did not go quietly. Before his departure, he made good on his threat, spreading the story of my father's disgrace to anyone who would listen. The tale grew in the telling, becoming more lurid and damning with each repetition, until Clara Weston was transformed from the daughter of a struggling solicitor into the spawn of a master criminal who had defrauded half the gentry of England. I will not pretend that it did not hurt. Some wounds never fully heal, and the shame I felt over my father's mistakes was one of those wounds. But Adrian was there, always, to remind me of who I truly was, to hold me when the whispers became too much, to tell me over and over that he loved me not in spite of my past, but because of it. It was during one of those dark times, when I had spent the day weeping over a particularly cruel article in one of the scandal sheets, that Adrian said something that changed everything. "They speak of your father as though he were a monster," he said quietly, holding me in his arms. "But they do not know the whole story. They do not know that he was a good man who made mistakes out of love for his daughter. They do not know that he spent his last years trying to make amends, to repay those he had wronged. They do not know that his legacy is not the money he took, but the woman he raised, a woman of courage and integrity who saved a fool of a duke from his own arrogance." I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face. "How can you be so sure?" I asked. "How can you know what he intended when even I do not?" Adrian smiled and kissed my forehead. "Because I know you," he said. "And I know that you could not be who you are if he had not loved you deeply and taught you well." In that moment, I understood something that had eluded me for years. My father's choices were his own, but they did not define me. I could honor his memory by living with the integrity he had always tried to instill in me, by using the gifts he had given me to make the world a little better than I had found it. I did not have to carry the weight of his shame. I could set it down at last, and so I did. The second year of our marriage was better than the first. The scandal began to fade, as scandals always do, replaced by fresher gossip about other unfortunate souls. Some members of society, curious about the infamous chambermaid who had become a duchess, began to call at Winterbourne Hall, and they found not the grasping social climber they had expected, but a gracious hostess who treated them with the same courtesy she extended to the lowest servant. Slowly, grudgingly, doors began to reopen. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough. And I found to my surprise that I did not care as much as I had thought I would. The approval of society, which had once seemed so impossibly important, had lost its power over me. I had something far more valuable. A husband who loved me, a home where I was welcomed, a purpose that gave meaning to my days. It was in the autumn of that second year that I received the news that would change everything once more. I was with child. Adrian wept when I told him, tears of joy streaming down his face. He held me as though I were made of spun glass, terrified that any sudden movement might shatter this precious gift we had been given. The months that followed were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. I was not young by the standards of childbirth, and the pregnancy was difficult, marked by weeks of illness that confined me to my bed. Adrian hovered constantly, driving the servants to distraction with his demands for updates, his insistence on being present for every consultation with the physician. But I was strong. I had survived poverty and servitude, scandal and heartbreak. I would survive this as well. Our daughter was born on a June morning, with the sun streaming through the windows of my chamber and the scent of roses drifting up from the garden below. She was small and perfect, with a downy cap of dark hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. When the midwife placed her in my arms, I understood, for the first time, what my father must have felt when he held me all those years ago. The overwhelming weight of love, the fierce determination to protect this tiny creature from all the cruelties of the world. We named her Rose, for the flowers that had adorned my wedding bouquet, for the garden where Adrian and I had shared our first stolen moments. She was the best of both of us, combining Adrian's nobility of spirit with my resilience and determination. And she was living proof that love, true love, could triumph over every obstacle that society placed in its path. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. Winterbourne Hall, once so cold and forbidding, became a place of warmth and laughter. Rose grew from a baby into a girl, bright and curious, with an intelligence that reminded me of my father, and a kindness that was entirely her own. Adrian doted on her shamelessly, carrying her on his shoulders through the gardens, reading to her every night before bed, teaching her to ride almost before she could walk. We had more children, a son, Thomas, who inherited his father's title and his mother's love of books, and another daughter, Eleanor, named for a grandmother she would never meet. Our family filled the empty spaces of the great house, bringing life to rooms that had stood silent for too long. I never forgot where I had come from. How could I, when reminders were everywhere? The corridors I had once scrubbed on my hands and knees, the kitchens where I had eaten my meals in silence, the servants' quarters where Adrian had found me that fateful night, my belongings packed and my heart breaking. But these reminders did not bring pain, not anymore. They were evidence of how far I had come, of what was possible when love defied the rigid boundaries of class and convention. I wore my past not as a shame, but as a badge of honor, proof that a woman's worth was not determined by her birth, but by her character. And when society finally accepted me, as it eventually did, I used my position to advocate for others like me, women who had been trapped by circumstance, servants who had been invisible for too long. I established schools for the children of the poor, funded shelters for women fleeing desperate situations, worked tirelessly to chip away at the walls that separated the privileged from the desperate. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was something, and that something mattered. Adrian stood beside me through it all, my partner and my champion, the man who had seen beyond the mask of a servant to the woman beneath. Our love did not diminish with the years. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex as we weathered the storms of life together. There were still hard times, of course. There always are. We buried friends and welcomed grandchildren. We watched our children grow and struggled to let them make their own mistakes. We faced illness and loss and the inevitable decline that comes with age. But through it all, we had each other. And that was enough. It is strange now to look back on the girl I once was, the frightened orphan scrubbing floors in the pre-dawn darkness, dreaming of nothing because dreams were not permitted to women of her station. I barely recognize her, that girl. She seems like a character from a story, someone who existed only on the page. But she was real. I was real. And everything that happened to me was real, even if it sometimes felt like a fairy tale. I am old now. My hair has gone white, my hands have grown frail, and my eyes are not what they once were. Adrian sits beside me as I write this, dozing in his chair by the fire, his face lined with age but still handsome to me, still the man who saw me when no one else would. We have lived a good life, he and I. A life filled with love and purpose, with challenges overcome and joys unexpected. We have proven that the barriers between us were not insurmountable, that class and convention could bow before the force of true devotion. But I do not want to be remembered for defying society. I want to be remembered for something simpler, for being a woman who loved deeply and was loved in return, who faced adversity with courage and emerged stronger for the struggle. That is the story I want to leave behind. That is the legacy I want my children and grandchildren to carry forward. Love is not about station or circumstance. It is about seeing another person truly, recognizing the soul beneath the surface, and choosing to stand beside them no matter what storms may come. It is about courage in the face of impossible odds and faith in the power of connection to overcome any obstacle. I was a chambermaid. I became a duchess. But what mattered most was not the title or the transformation. What mattered most was that one October evening, I looked up from a stack of documents and met the eyes of a man who would change my life forever. What mattered most was that I had the courage to whisper, "Do not sign, my lord." And what mattered most was that he, against all reason and expectation, listened. That is the true ending of my story. Not a fairy tale of transformation, but a love story of recognition. Two people who saw each other across the vast divide of class and convention, who chose each other despite everything that stood between them, who built a life together that defied the narrow expectations of their world. It was not easy. Nothing worth having ever is. But it was worth it. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt and fear. It was all worth it. Because in the end, love is the only thing that matters. And I was loved. I was loved. The fire crackles low in the hearth as I set down my pen. Adrian stirs in his chair, and I reach out to take his hand, marveling as I always do at the miracle of his presence beside me. His fingers close around mine, warm and familiar, and he smiles without opening his eyes. "Still writing?" he murmurs. "Almost finished," I say. He brings my hand to his lips and kisses it, the same gesture he has made 1,000 times over the years, still as tender as the first. "I love you, Clara," he says, and I him. After all this time, after all we have endured, the words still carry the same weight, the same wonder. "I love you too, Adrian." Outside the window, the first stars are appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house, I can hear the voices of our grandchildren, laughing and playing, filling Winterbourne Hall with the sounds of life and joy. This is my story. This is our story, and it is finally complete.